Greetings and salutations, friends, and welcome back to some more Warhammer 40k lore. Well, today we're going to talk about the Scythes of the Emperor, because these guys were my first favourite chapter before I even knew what a chapter was. They have a really great colour scheme, although, man, it does not work on their new Primaris, which, well, it's one of the curses, or the poor Scythes of the Emperor, in that in the original lore, they were one of those tragic chapters whose fate had already been written. They were the valiant defenders of their home world, overrun and destroyed by the tyranids, reducing the chapter to nothing more than a handful of valiant survivors, fighting a desperate yet doomed struggle to protect what was once theirs. To me, all the way back then, when I first saw them in, I think, was it a White Dwarf? Or was it one of the painting guides, I think? So I remember there were tons of other chapters there as well, and I thought, my god, this 40k thing is awesome. Here you have this band of brothers, a grouping of heroes, 200 strong, that in any other timeline would be titans. They still have the force to conquer planets, and yet they were crushed completely and utterly and forced into a desperate flight, because that is just how ungodly dangerous the Tyranid Hive fleet is. It lent an enormous amount of gravitas to both the Tyranid, the size of the Emperor, and the universe in general, by making it a large, dangerous, violent world where even the heroes don't always get to go home at the end of their adventures. As I'd also recently finished reading The Lord of the Rings at the time, that was a really cool juxtaposition to the more traditional good versus evil storytelling. Of course, then the walking MacGuffin by the name of Belisarius Call came along and simply hand-waved all of that out of existence, as now the Scythes of the Emperor are practically back to full strength again, having been reinforced by the millions of Adeptus Astartes that Call had squirreled away in his labs over the years. But oh well, details. Let us simply shuffle that to the back of our minds for now, and instead start, as usual, at the very beginning, with the creation of the Scythes of the Emperor, or with what was going to be the Scythes of the Emperor, that is. As the world they were put upon to defend will be quite familiar to anyone who's read through the Horus Heresy series, as it was of course the world of Sotha, which contained the Pharos device, the enormous plot point that allowed... I mean, you can't tell me I'm wrong. That allowed roboute guilliman to summon the loyalists scattered throughout the galaxy during the Ruin Storm to the Ultima Segmentum and his temporary Imperium Secundus. The Pharos were an enormous series of structures built upon the planet in a long bygone age, which were clearly Xenos in origin and exceedingly mysterious. Roboute guilliman had ordered that the very presence of this strange structure be kept a secret, even as he tried to unlock whatever lay within it by conducting research on it, as clearly it was something weird, and he had a hunch that it would become very important at some point in the future. The person that finally figured out what the Pharos was, or at the very least what it could be used as, was the loyalist Iron Warrior Barabbas d'Antioch, who had been recruited by the Ultramarines after he refused his Primarch Peterabo's summons to the front line and the rebellion against the Emperor. The d'Antioch had been one of the finest minds within the Iron Warriors. In part, it was that mind that got him banished from the Legion initially to some backwater outpost, and made him an easy target for recruitment for the Ultramarines. Antioch managed to figure out that the Pharos beacon was some sort of communications and travel device. The Pharos functioned using technology and logic that was far beyond the Imperium at the time. But after some trial and error, Antioch succeeded in establishing a connection to the world of Macragge at the heart of Ultramar, and more precisely, directly into Primarch roboute Guilliman's personal palace on the planet. Servants in the palace had for quite some time been reporting strange activities, possibly warp or chaos related in nature, as the Imperium had only then, slowly but surely, started to learn about the more malicious elements of the warp. After the events of Calth, Guilliman was obviously extraordinarily suspicious of anything that could possibly be related to that dark force, and so he ordered Ultramarine guards to keep a close watch on the palace, and for any further supernatural disturbances to be reported to him immediately. These little mysteries would later be revealed to be a part of Antioch's attempts to communicate with the Primarch. Voices would appear in otherwise empty rooms, strange distant sounds would be heard, or the notes of some unfamiliar musical instrument would echo through the halls of the palace. Creepy shit, to be sure, but it turned out to be a simple telephone call, as during one of these disturbances, the Primarch himself was summoned along with his honor guard. They entered the room extremely wary of trickery or other nonsense, especially since the Primarch had recently been exposed to an assassination attempt by the Alpha Legion, but inside of the room he did not find Alpha Legion assassins or demons, but instead Barabbas Antioch, the Iron Warrior that roboute Guilliman himself had ordered to a planet he knew to be damn near the other side of Ultramar. Clearly, some fuckery was afoot, and Guilliman asked Antioch to explain himself, which he did. The Pharos were indeed some sort of communications and travel device, though the travel part was at the time only theorized at. It was a bit later when Conrad Curse, who had arrived on Macragge, having hitched a ride on the Lion's flagship, almost succeeded in killing in roboute Guilliman, that the travel capabilities were revealed, as Antioch reached out a hand to Guilliman and managed to pull him through the connection and to Sotha, a journey of many, many light years carried out in seconds. And that was not even the end of the Pharos' incredible power and convenience, as not only could it create a link for communication and teleportation in extenuating circumstances, the Pharos could also be used to illuminate an entire planet in the warp, recreating the marvelous miracle of the lighthouse on Terra. Unsurprisingly, Guilliman was a pinch hesitant about doing this, seeing as his realm was currently encapsulated by an enormous chaos-fueled warp storm, through which his enemies prowled in their thousands, but he realized that he was going to need enemies, and he was going to need some way of communications and travel, and so he agreed to have Macragge illuminated as a rallying point for loyalist forces, which turned out to be a very wise decision indeed, as it allowed Guilliman to gather together the otherwise lost and scattered elements of other legions. This would eventually also allow him to break through the ruin storm with an enormous relief fleet to save Terra in its darkest hour, as Guilliman had already assumed that the Imperium at large had fallen to the chaos threat, which is why he had taken the extraordinary step of creating Imperium Secundus. But the moment he was informed that there was still hope, he rallied his forces to save the Imperium, leaving behind a company of Ultramarines, the 199th, to defend Sotha and its incredible and obvious strategic importance. And it was during the Horus heresy as well that Sotha would see its first action, as the Night Lords invaded the planet, having been brought there by the beacon and the possibility of using it to their own ends, including looking for another Primarch which they had misplaced somewhat at the time. The defenders were able to barely stave off the Night Lord's invasion, in large part due to the sacrifice of the Pharos and Barabbas d'Antioch, who sacrificed his own life to overload the Pharos mechanism, creating a tremendous surge of energy which disabled the Night Lord's fleet in orbit, allowing the defenders to finally gain the upper hand. This also, however, had a rather unfortunate and unknowable side effect at the time, as the tremendous surge of energy drew the attention of the tyranids, who had been lying in wait out there in the deep darkness beyond the 41st Millennium's galaxy, looking for signs to home in on. Which opens the door for a lot of interesting speculation, doesn't it? We're not going to get too deep into it here because it is a bit of a wider subject, but the Pharos were apparently some sort of Necron construction, an attempt to create a faster-than-light form of travel that was not reliant upon the warp, since, of course, the Necron are not particularly fond of chaos or the Immaterium in general. If the Tyranid were then specifically bioengineered to look for signs of Necron energy, well, who were the Necrons fighting that might have a vested interest in seeing endless armies of monsters descend upon them? And incidentally, this Forerunner civilization, some old ones, shall we call them, perhaps? Don't they have a little bit of a history, too, of creating some species that tend to backfire on them, like, the ones that created a Chaos God, for example? It's speculation, of course, but the whole mentions of a dark and empty galaxy beyond suggest that maybe their latest creation was a bit more ferocious than they necessarily intended. Or maybe even the dark outside the galaxy is simply a moat created to contain the 41st Millennium's galaxy. Who knows? But again, enough backstory. The 199th Company of the Ultramarines Legion had suffered heavy casualties during the invasion of Sotha, and would continue to exist within the Ultramarines Legion as a shadow entity, theoretically there and yet not wholly acknowledged. This would grow even worse and even more unacknowledged when Guilliman introduced the Codex Astartes to the Imperium and pushed forth the idea that the legions ought to be shattered and broken down into much smaller component parts, which could only consist of 10 companies, the chapter-style organization of the modern-day Astartes. The Ultramarines would also be bound by the rules and guidance of the Codex Astartes, except, of course, in roboute Guilliman's infinite hypocrisy, he maintained an 11th company of the Ultramarines, which was, of course, the 199th. The Protectors of Sotha. And, well, to be fair, Guilliman did make it very clear that the Codex Astartes was meant to be a guideline rather than hard and fast rules, but he seems to have been the only one who got the message, and he never really endeavored to make that part particularly clear either, mind you, but oh well. After Guilliman's internment within the stasis field on Macragge, the Ultramarines chapter continued to maintain the 11th Shadow Company, although it was considered a bit of a stain on the chapter, and a bit of dodgy history as well. It certainly made a lot of sense to assign a special garrison force to Sotha when the Pharos beacon was still operational, but to now maintain this force, first and foremost, the point seems to have long since disappeared. There doesn't seem to be a reason anymore for an 11th company, especially as at the time it was made up of a single warrior. As the only remaining warden of the Pharos was Obadiah, a humble scout when he had first been given the duty of watching over the Pharos beacon and Sotha by Guilliman personally. And there was also the wider implications to be taken into consideration here. The fact that Imperium Secundus had ever been created or even thought of was a deeply guarded secret, and as the Imperium grew more dogmatic and religious, that was a secret that grew more and more difficult to ever reveal, shall we say, to the point where, should it be made public that roboute Guilliman had created a second Imperium as the first was still fighting, it would at best result in heavy censor being placed upon the Ultramarines, and at worst, potentially the ultimate sanction of excommunicatis traitoris. A solution to the problem needed to be found, and preferably a nice, quiet, secret, and expedient solution as well, but this was not a quandary that could be resolved quite so easily. On the one hand, it sounds simple enough. Surely you simply just dispatched an officer to Sotha to inform Obadiah that his services were no longer needed, and then, quietly, without any fanfare, enroll him in one of the existing companies of the Ultramarines. No one would ever be the wiser. It was just a single Astartes after all. He would be lost in the paperwork in a matter of minutes. The problem, however, was that Obadiah had been given an order directly by the Primarch. He had been made to swear an oath of moment that still existed. Literally, the Oath of Moment, a parchment scroll upon which an oath is made, was right there. Obadiah had it. In effect, he was still under contract, a contract with the Primarch of the Ultramarines. You couldn't just ignore that. And even if you were to set aside the obvious moral and ethical bindings this placed upon the Ultramarines chapter, there was the more immediate concerns of the secrecy as well. Because if Obadiah decided to make a stink about his sudden reassignment and what he might very well perceive to be a breach of his oath forced upon him by the distant leadership of Macragge, well, he could hold up literal black and white evidence to show that the Ultramarines were in violation of the Codex Astartes, and that they were in violation of it on the direct orders of the Primarch that had forced all the other legions to shatter. Yeah, this was a bit of a problem. And so the timing to resolve it needed to be chosen very, very carefully. Fortunately, in the 32nd millennium, an opportunity to finally untangle this little Gordian knot presented itself with the third founding of the Astartes. Chapter Master of the Ultramarines, a person by the name of Tigris Deacon, dispatched a representative to Sotha to contact the captain of the 11th Company of the Ultramarines chapter. He offered him two choices. Either he must return to the Ultramarines and never speak of his duty on Sotha ever again, and in return he will be given command of the 5th Company of the Ultramarines chapter, or, should Obadiah reject this honor, he had an opportunity to maintain his commitment to Sotha and to the Primarch by creating a new chapter. That way, he could remain on Sotha. He could remain the Warden of the Pharos. And the Ultramarines would finally be rid of their 11th liability. Now, I would of course never be quite so crass as to call this a bribe or anything, but surely a promotion to Chapter Master must have tickled Obadiah's fancy quite a bit, as he was hesitant to join up with the Ultramarines, but at the promise of being given a chapter of his own, though he was still a bit hesitant, he finally agreed. And a group of some 70-odd Ultramarines was dispatched to Sotha to create the foundations of what was to become, finally, the Scythes of the Emperor. They would have to spend a long-ass time on Sotha before they were ready to be deployed in any real scope, scale, or effective capabilities. 100 Space Marines may be theoretically quite the force, but when they're the only 100 Space Marines you've got, yes, you might want a couple more before you start venturing out into orc-infested territory. Now, granted, luckily, the Scythes of the Emperor found themselves in a relatively quiet part of the Imperium, near a little-known region of space known as the Damocles Gulf, which had nothing interesting or dangerous at the time, luckily. The chapter's name and iconography are both drawn from the planet of Sotha itself, as it was home to a rather remarkable biosphere. The Pharos was surrounded by exceptionally rapid-growing forests and other various plant life, to the point where it had to be constantly cut back in near never-ending maintenance of any and all settlements on the planet. The chapter, once they had created a fortress monastery, set about this duty alongside the civilian populace, using what the civilians were using: scythes. Except, of course, way bigger and tougher to accommodate their Astartes physique. And the Scythes of the Emperor developed an incredibly good relationship with the locals, near salamander level, really. And as the chapter slowly but surely expanded its numbers, it took upon itself the safeguarding of not just Sotha, but nearby imperial settlements and mining outposts as well. The early years of the chapter were spent expanding their influence and protecting these outlying settlements and outposts that were otherwise too far away from the Imperium's real inner workings to usually receive much, if anything, in the way of military support. The Scythes of the Emperor made considerable crackdowns upon pirate activity in the area, crushing the odd Xenos presence and protecting against orc raiders. Initially, their limited number meant that they could only really protect these areas, but over time they grew able to carry out offensive operations against the enemy itself. Instead of treating the symptoms, the attack, they were able to expand outwards into nearby space and actually actively decimate, destroy, and outright crush many of the human, alien, and orc pirate cells operating in the area. Until eventually they had created their own little mini kingdom with remarkable peace for any area of the Imperium. As the Scythes eventually hit full strength and they had solidified their own holdings, they even began expanding outwards yet further, engaging several nearby Orc mini-empires and getting in the way of Orc migrationary paths. They were becoming a good, real and active part of Ultramar's defenses. They even had enough spare strength left over to take part in Imperial crusades. The most famous of which was, of course, the Damocles Gulf Crusade, as the area, which had been essentially pointless and beneath notice previously, had become home to an upstart little race of blueberry communists known as the Tau, who had been expanding far too quickly for the Imperium's comfort. Due to their vicinity, the Scythes of the Emperor was one of several Astartes chapters that lent their aid to the endeavor, which was, by Crusade standards, a pretty damn small one, in large part due to the fact that the Imperium was convinced that whatever was in the Damocles Gulf was, clearly doing something, but it was no threat or anything. They could surely just bombard it, if nothing else. But the Tau proved to be a bit more of a challenge than the Imperium had reckoned with, in large part due to well, let's be honest, plot reasons. As whenever the Imperium discovered a world they didn't care too much about, they simply bombarded it into submission and then moved on. Not even full exterminators, merely large-scale planetary bombardment. There was nothing stopping the Imperium from doing that to every Tau world they encountered, but again, due to plot reasons, they decided to instead engage in a ground war with the Tau. This was silly and pointless in the extreme, especially considering the relatively small-scale nature of the crusade. The Damocles Gulf Crusade had to engage in, well, on the Tau's term, really, with limited formations going up against the much more mobile Tau enemy. This is not how the Imperium is supposed to fight. What the Imperium should have been doing is simply bringing in overwhelming numbers and say to the Tau, okay, you're not going to defend your population centers or any fixed areas of strategic importance? Fine. We'll just glass your cities, destroy any and all logistical infrastructure, bomb the hell out of your supply centers, and then occupy the entire planet with tens of millions of Imperial Guard troops, and then move on. Eventually, you're gonna run out of ammo. Nice and simple, really. Hell, they could literally just poison the entire planet's biosphere if they so wanted. But, again, it made for a better fight if the Tau weren't completely cream-pied out of existence, I do suppose. And then, the plot-convenient arrival of the tyranids, who had spent the last 10,000-odd years slowly waffling their way towards the 41st Millennium's galaxy, arriving just in time to save the little blueberry-coloured asses of the space socialists. At this point, Hive Fleet Behemoth had already arrived in the galaxy and had already been defeated. This incursion was named Hive Fleet Kraken, and its teeth had already been sinking into the Imperium for quite some time, at the point where the Sires of the Emperor were first made aware of their incursion. For you see, unlike the hammer blow delivered by Behemoth, Kraken was a far sneakier approach. They had spent the 250-odd years between itself and Behemoth launching an infiltration effort, even managing to gain several positions within the Imperial organization intended to be on the lookout for a second Tyranid invasion. And so by the time that the Inquisition finally grew concerned and suspicious of the weird reports coming out of the eastern fringes, Kraken was already deep within the Imperium's borders. This obviously severely hampered any real large-scale response, as the forces of the Adeptus Astartes, the Imperial Navy and the Imperial Guard were suddenly called upon to act quickly, which is something they are simply incapable of doing. Many of you will already have watched my video on how the Imperium reacts to threats, and in essence, it is a proportional response. It takes a very, very long time for the Imperium to actually gear up for the kind kind of war that an invading Hive fleet requires. And with successful infiltration efforts, the Hive fleet was already on the doorsteps before the Imperium even knew it was attacking, leaving many chapters, including the Scythes of the Emperor, with their homeworlds suddenly on the front line against the Hive fleet, with no opportunity to skirmish with the invader, no opportunity to slow them down or call in reinforcements, or even ready their own fortress monasteries or their local militia. Painfully aware of their oath of moment dedicating themselves to the defense of Sotha, the Scythes of the Emperor double-timed back to the planet, just in time to array their full strength against the invading Hive fleet. Now, a chapter's homeworld is a massively defended planet. The Space Marines' fortress monastery itself is a near impenetrable mass of fortifications, in the case of Sotha, built into the literal mountain tops of the Pharos. It would have taken any other force an incredible amount of time and casualties to even breach its fortifications, but against an entire invading Hive fleet, resistance was quite literally futile. The Scythes would reap a tremendous toll on the invading tyranids, but even as the Scythes were defending their fortress monastery, skirmishing across the planet and bringing what survivors they could to apparent safety, the tyranids devoured the entire planet. Even if the Scythes killed 1 million Tyranid lifeforms, and they probably did and more, it was a drop in the bucket compared to the combined biomass of an entire world. Eventually, the fortress monastery was simply subsumed beneath an endless wave of invaders descending from the skies and the ground below. The chapter's fleet, which had been desperately holding position above the fortress monastery, attempting to deny the aerial approach at least, finally had to admit that they could not hold out any longer against the encroaching Hive fleet. And the chapter master of the Scythes of the Emperor, Thokira, had to make the hard decision. He could stay on the planet and join the Knights of Eternity in absolute oblivion and destruction, or he could try one last desperate breakout attempt. This would place him in violation of his chapter's ancient oath, but it might save the chapter as well. He chose the latter, and some 200 battle brothers managed to break out of the surrounding Tyranid horde and escape up into orbit, where they rendezvoused with the scattered and bruised remnants of the Scythes' navy. Whereupon all they could do was turn around and slip quietly and desperately into the warp as they saw the planet their Primarch had ordered them to defend be eaten alive by the invader and reduced to nothing more than a dead, barren rock. With 800 of their brothers dead, the loss of their chapter master, and the near entirety of their chapter's arms and arsenal, the Scythes of the Emperor became a vagrant chapter. They swore that they would continue hunting down the splinters of Hive Fleet Kraken until there were none left, whilst trying to rebuild their numbers. A difficult task at the best of times, and a much worse one for a homeless chapter. Now, there are absolutely those who have risen like a phoenix from the ashes, even from defeats as devastating as this, or worse ones yet. But the Scythes of the Emperor were also in a bit of a unique position, where they were very hesitant to reach out to the Imperium for help and the release of their gene seed reserves on Mars, because during the invasion of Sotha, several of the chapter's members had been attacked by gene stealers and infected by their vile taint and strain during the invasion. This is a process normally used by the gene stealers during the infiltration phase of their offensive to well, literally, bioengineer other humans to become slaves of the hive mind. Luckily, an Astartes is made of sterner stuff than the average human, and the Scythes were able to resist the influence of the hive mind. But the Scythes feared, for good reason, that the Imperium would not be quite so lenient in its judgment of them. At the very least, in the minds of the more puritanical inquisitors, the chapter was already tainted, irreversibly so, and the Imperium could never again have any real and true guarantee that the chapter was actually pure, as any pretenses put on might simply be a ruse concocted by the hive mind. And any request for a reinforcement and replacement gene seed would almost certainly come with requests from the adept biologists to receive samples of the Scythe's current gene seed to make sure that they were worth replenishing. And so it seemed that the Scythes were doomed to destruction. They would continue throwing themselves at the splinters of Hive Fleet Kraken, seeking out vengeance wherever they could find it, whilst desperately attempting to replenish their ranks from the few scattered, decent recruits they could pick up on one world or another, reliant entirely on their own gene seed production and their ability to replenish the progenoid glands in each and every Astartes. A thin hope at the best of times. In all due likelihood, the 200 battle brothers would have burned themselves out over the course of the next few hundred years, replenishing one of their numbers only to lose 3 in constant war against the tyranid now infesting the sector. And tragic though that may be, it is also a very 40k thing. The Space Marines are humanity's greatest defenders, its most powerful champions, but here's the thing. If you simply have an infallible shield and a sword that will never grow blunt, you have nothing to fear. If you have perfect defenders capable of winning every battle, what danger is there in the universe? What reason is there to fear anything? What investment is there? Danger is only dangerous if it is actually capable of inflicting harm upon something. The fact that even the Imperium's greatest defenders can be brought low, can be defeated, and can be killed is what makes them the Imperium's greatest defenders in its darkest days. If, on the other hand, you introduce a character that is simply capable of snapping his fingers and bringing a chapter back from the brink of defeat time and time again, you've made defeat irrelevant. You have made loss worthless. The Scythes of the Emperor were such a cool chapter because they were the Grim Reapers. Their very iconography was that of the man with the scythe, with death, with doom and hopelessness. And sure, this has been expanded upon to make it make sense from an initial standpoint, but that was nevertheless the pitch of the chapter. Their reason for existence was to prove that this was a dangerous universe. And by removing that reason for existence, both the Scythes and the tyranids and 40k as a whole has been diminished. At the very least, in my none too humble opinion. Until next time, I've been Arch. Thank you all very much for listening, and I hope to see you all again soon. Till then, have a good day.